Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we're jumping straight into a totally fascinating exploration of ancient poetic imagery. Today, we're going to take a completely impartial, analytical look at the structural metaphors woven right into an incredible piece of historical literature, Psalm 75. If you're the kind of person who loves dissecting how ancient writers used language to tackle massive concepts like power, stability, and consequence, you are absolutely going to love this.
I mean, just listen to how this text establishes tension right out of the gate in verse 3. It says, "When the earth totters and all its inhabitants, it is I who keep steady its pillars." Instantly, we're thrown into a situation of immense cosmic scale. The very ground is shaking, literally everything is on the brink of collapse, and yet this single solitary voice claims to be holding it all together. It's just a breathtaking hook for a poem, and it totally sets the stage for everything we're about to uncover today.
All right, let's move into section 1, introducing Psalm 75, and get ourselves grounded in the historical context.
So before we unpack all these visual metaphors, we need to know exactly what source material we're looking at, right? We'll be analyzing the English Standard Version of Psalm 75. And before the first verse even begins, we get this wealth of information right in the superscription. It labels the text a psalm of Asaph, it calls it a song, and it even gives specific directions to the choir master to perform it according to Do Not Destroy. That tells us right away that this wasn't just some poem meant to be read quietly in a room. This was a highly auditory, communal experience.
Now, you might be wondering, what do these specific musical and historical terms actually mean for us? Well, the mention of Asaph points to a specific musical guild or author associated with the ancient temple. It gives us a real historical anchor for the text. Plus, as you read through it, you'll see the word Selah pop up, like at the end of verse 3. Now, while scholars do debate its exact meaning, they generally agree it's a structural marker. Think of it like a deliberate musical pause, or maybe a signal for a massive crescendo. It's brilliant because it shows us exactly how these ancient songs were engineered to control the pacing and the impact on the audience.
So the text officially opens up in verse 1 with this incredibly warm, collective voice. It says, "We give thanks to you, O God. We give thanks, for your name is near." And then it goes on to recount wondrous deeds. But what's really fascinating here is a tiny detail tucked away in the translation notes. A footnote in our source indicates that the Hebrew text can actually also translate to "they recount." So right off the bat, the poem establishes a community, a group of people looking back at history and collectively acknowledging these past events.
Let's transition to section 2, studying the tottering earth. This is where we see the cosmic balance come into play. Watch how the pacing suddenly shifts here. We start with that collective thanksgiving, but out of nowhere, the poem executes a dramatic shift in perspective. The we is completely gone. According to verse 2, a divine voice takes over the narrative, announcing, "At the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity." This introduces the core theme of the entire piece, the promise of absolute equitable judgment. And notice the precision. It's not just happening randomly. It is scheduled for a specific, appointed timeline determined solely by this divine speaker.
And this brings us to our very first major visual metaphor. The poem paints a picture of a completely chaotic, unstable world. The earth and its inhabitants are literally tottering, just on the absolute edge of collapse. Yet it's held together by this cosmic balancing act, stabilized only by the steadying hands of a sovereign judge who grasps the pillars of the earth. It creates such a vivid image of total dependence on a central stabilizing authority.
Okay, moving right along to section 3, the metaphor of the horn, where we look at symbols of hubris.
What is super interesting here is how the narrative arc zooms all the way in. We go from the massive cosmic scale of a tottering planet right down to the ground level hubris of humanity. In verses 4 and 5, that divine voice issues a direct, sharp warning to the arrogant. Just listen to the repetition here. "I say to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up your horn. Do not lift up your horn on high or speak with haughty neck." The repetition of "do not lift up your horn" really drives home this strict command against arrogance. To really grasp what's going on, we have to unpack this ancient idiom. Like, why a horn? Well, in the poetic and cultural context of this text, an animal's horn is a potent literary symbol. Sure, it represents strength and power, but in this specific usage, it symbolizes arrogant human power. It's dangerous pride. It's outright defiance against that stabilizing authority we were just talking about. Adding the phrase a haughty neck paints this vivid picture of someone refusing to bow, just standing there stiff and stubbornly defiant.
The poem then uses a really fascinating process of elimination in verses 6 and 7 to explain where true power actually originates. It looks at the compass points. It says true exaltation, or lifting up, does not originate from the east, it does not originate from the west, and it doesn't come from the wilderness, which would have been the south in this specific geographical context. The visual emphasis is crystal clear. True elevation doesn't come from any geographical direction on Earth. Human maneuvering, it's ultimately pointless.
So, the crucial takeaway is summarized right here. The text explicitly claims that the authority to elevate or demote belongs solely to the divine. God acts as the ultimate equalizer, actively putting down one and lifting up another. That completely strips all agency away from those boastful horns we just looked at.
This brings us to section 4, the Cup of Judgment, a mandatory draft. All right, this is truly the climax of the poem's imagery. Verse 8 introduces a highly dynamic, incredibly intense visual metaphor of judgment that you won't soon forget. The text reads, "For in the hand of the Lord there's a cup with foaming wine well mixed, and he pours out from it." Picture a divine figure holding this potent, overflowing cup. The wine isn't just sitting there flat. It is active, it's foaming, it is well mixed, meaning it is fully prepared and highly, highly potent. But make no mistake, this is not a cup of celebration. The passage depicts this as a mandatory draft of judgment. The rest of verse 8 says, "And all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs." Judgment is presented here as an unavoidable, bitter drink that the wicked are forced to consume entirely. They don't get to just take a polite sip. They have to drink it down to the very dregs, that bitter, gross sediment sitting at the bottom of the cup. It is the total, absolute consumption of consequence. And we wrap things up with verse 10, which perfectly encapsulates the structural balance of the entire poem. It contrasts a final duality, the fate of the horns. For side A, the wicked, their defiant power, their horns, will be entirely severed, cut off completely. But for side B, the righteous, their horns shall be actively lifted up. The poem ends by visually resolving all the tension it introduced at the beginning, proving the divine speaker's earlier claim that they, and they alone, do the putting down and the lifting up. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. When you look at how brilliantly this ancient song constructed its imagery, you really have to ask, how do these ancient metaphors of tottering pillars, boastful horns, and foaming cups continue to shape our understanding of literature, power, and justice today? I mean, these symbols are thousands of years old, yet they still resonate so strongly with anyone analyzing the dynamics of human pride and ultimate accountability. It's just fascinating stuff. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking closely at the text, and I will see you next time.